Thanksgiving.
Did you?
I did. It was quiet, but it was nice. Good food. It's one of the main things, right?
Where'd you go?
To my parents. Just me and my parents this year. So my sister was I think she was with her in-laws. I'm not really sure. But they were not with us.
That's the sister with the baby?
Yes. But yeah, so very low key, but not bad.
Before we get started, can I ask you a very general question?
Sure.
What makes us think that Moses wrote these books?
So, some of it is tradition. Like that's the tradition that the stories were handed down through Moses. Much of one of the theories that and the one that I tend to agree with the most is that, Richard, will you just make sure you close it when they start coming in for covering? You can leave it open for a little bit, but when they come in for a whole bunch of people come in, it gets loud.
I'll just close now.
Thank you. What am I saying? So the theory that I'm kind of always hold to is that Moses wrote most of it. Some of the early stories, like the Genesis, stories would have had to have been passed down to him in some way. But then there was a later, they call it a redactor, that went back in and added some little pieces. Like that's where we get the very end of Deuteronomy that says, and there has not, since at that time, there's not been a prophet like Moses and things like that. There's certain things that give hints to timing and things that they think were added back in a little bit later. But as far as the actual, how most of them are actually attributed to Moses, I think it's probably fairly, and there are some who think, it was, tons of different people that they just kind of put all these things together. But really the majority view says there's no reason to believe Moses didn't write them. He would have been able to write, he would have had the ability to do this. And with text this old, it's difficult. It's difficult to get back to the very beginning, and so there's some element that we don't really know, but it is tradition, and there's really, the scholars who study this kind of thing, most of them would agree that there's no reason to believe that he didn't write the vast majority of it. And then, like I said, there were probably a couple of little things added in that give us some historical markings, basically, toward the end.
Is the fact that it's been written and rewritten and retranslated, there's really no way you can depend on a similar style, is there?
They can, and that's one of the things, and that's why so this is one of the arguments that Moses maybe didn't write all of it, or particularly the Genesis stories, is because we have the two creation accounts in Genesis 1 and 2, and they're different, and they use different wording, and so they think those might have come from different sources, so they can to some extent. And the thing is, Bible translation is always a really very heavily debated topic, because they're like, it's been retranslated, and how do we know, and all this stuff. But ancient texts, and particularly sacred ancient texts, they were very meticulous and very careful with how they wrote them, and there weren't very many copies to start with, which is also partially why we don't have originals of the Old Testament. Particularly, but we do have more. There are more transcripts throughout history of different books of the Bible than any other ancient document. So the authenticity of it is probably pretty good. And most of and a lot of people study it more in the New Testament than the Old Testament. The Old Testament's a little bit because some of it's so much older, is a bit more difficult. But so looking even at the New Testament, even the differences that happen, which oftentimes it's easy to tell if it's a mistake, somebody wrote the wrong letter or something. It's easy to pick those things out. Something just doesn't quite fit as you're reading along or something, so it's easy to catch those errors. Like a typo, it's easy to, ancient typos basically. But any that are different are very, there's basically nothing that changes the meaning of the text. And so it's this, the history and it shows that it has been so carefully preserved that we can rely on it, is my point. But attributing it to the books of Moses, to Moses specifically, is difficult to prove definitively, but the general opinion is that there's no reason to not think that Moses wrote, the vast majority of the books of Moses.
Fair enough.
This is very, and I am not the expert on these things, of course, but there are people who are experts on these things. It's interesting to me. I'm interested in the canonization of the Bible and how things have been passed down and how that has happened, but it's a whole nother world.
Compared to me, you're the world's leading authority.
I'll do that.
Well, that's scary, but anyway, moving on. We can jump into the Torah portion. So, this week, we kind of start these last several portions in Genesis focus on Joseph. So Joseph, interestingly enough, is we kind of have this is the longest narrative about a particular person other than Moses in the Torah. So Joseph is an important person. However, I would like to take a little while and talk about Judah. So, kind of right in the middle of this Torah portion, we have this seemingly kind of dropped in there, why did you put this story here? Why do we have this story at all? Story about Judah and Tamar. And this is the story, and I have done this in the past. This is the story that goes, as you're talking through, you go, yeah, and we're talking about Joseph, and then we have this weird thing about Judah and Tamar, and then we go back to Joseph, and we just kind of skip over it. We're going to talk about Judah and Tamar today for a little bit, and then we'll get back to talking about Joseph. But we get to hang out with Joseph for another couple weeks, so we're going to talk about Judah mostly today. Just to give us a little bit of where this falls in the story and why, an idea of why it might fall there. We don't really know, but an idea of why this might make sense. So the chapter 37, and we'll go back and talk through this a little bit more, but just to get us in the story here. So 37 is about Joseph, and he has these dreams that his brothers and his father even are going to bow down to him, and his brothers don't like him very much. He's his father's favorite son, very favored apparently, and so his brothers, are scheming to kill him, eventually decide that maybe killing is a bit too extreme. We're going to sell him into slavery instead. And, they're so kind. And end up, taking, of course, his tunic and taking it back to their father dipped in blood. And his father assumes that he's been killed. And then, in chapter 38, about that time, interesting. So this is seemingly right after Joseph is sold into slavery, being taken to Egypt. And then Judah went and camped to a camp near an Adulamite man. And then, verse 2, he marries the daughter of a Canaanite. Well, that's interesting. Because the Hebrew people are not supposed to marry Canaanites, right? All right, well, there we go. We have Judah marrying a Canaanite woman. And they have 3 sons. And his first son gets married to Tamar and dies. And this is a very interesting situation because in verse 7 it says, Judah's firstborn was evil in Adonai's eyes, so Adonai put him to death. And this is a very strange passage. Normally we know why they're evil. We don't actually know why he was evil. We don't know what brought this sentence upon him. We just know that he was evil, Adonai judged him as evil, and Adonai put him to death. So, this is just not something that happens a whole lot, so it's very interesting that this person, that God kind of had to step in here.
Does it ever happen?
Does it ever happen? I believe this is the first one. I believe it does happen from time to time. I don't know that it's quite this direct, and usually there's a reason given. Usually there's God said to do this, you did this instead, and so you died. Usually there's more of a story to it. It's not usually just, this man was evil, he died. So this is a particularly mysterious one.
Well, I guess.
So, one commentary. This is just kind of food for thought. I don't know you can think about this what you want. Some people think, so the name of the son, in Hebrew, if you reverse the letters, you get Ra, which is the word for evil. So even in the name, some scholars like to put significance on that. It's just, I don't know. Could be, sure. So anyway, so has died. So then we get more instruction about this later in the Torah, but we have this situation where if one brother dies, the next brother marries the wife, she has a son, it carries on the first brother's name, right? So this is an interesting situation.
That would only be if the other brother wasn't married. Or not?
Not necessarily.
Okay.
I mean, I think it probably was mostly if the other brother wasn't married. But at this time, we're still in this world of multiple wives.
Okay.
So, and really, it's actually, this is hard for our modern Western minds to wrap our minds around, but this is actually for the benefit of the woman. This is actually to take care of the woman.
Okay.
Because in ancient world, a widowed woman with no children is probably going to become a prostitute or be begging or a slave, or, I mean, it's not going to go well for her.
Okay.
Unless someone just has a very kind heart and decides to take her in and care for her. Your livelihood and your survival is very much based on your husband and then later your children.
Okay.
So really this is about caring for the woman. We kind of have to make our minds think that way, but that really is the case here. And that's why some of this plays out the way that it does. So keep that in mind as we continue to go on, is that this is not like, this woman is property, we're shuffling her along. It's like the purpose is actually to take care of her.
So that she'll have a provider.
So that she'll have a provider and that she'll have a lineage and that she's not gonna just be left out on the streets to die, basically. So we have this understanding, and so apparently this was happening way back here even before we have the law, and this is just part of ancient culture that the next son would take the wife. And so Judah follows through on this, and his next son is supposed to marry Tamar, but Onan is not pleased with this because he knows that the child that she bears will not be considered his. It will bring another. So again, in ancient culture, you're concerned about inheritance. So originally there were 3 sons, and so when Judah's dies or passes on the birthright and the blessing, it's going to be split between those 3 sons. Usually the first gets a double portion, but still they would all get something. So with one dying, now there's 2 sons that are going to get the inheritance. So, but if Onan has, if she has a child that is attributed to we're split, the inheritance is split again. So that could be part of why he's doing this. Maybe he's just malicious. Again, we don't have a ton in the text, but in ancient culture, that's what's going on. And so he could be looking out for himself and saying, hey, this is really not good. This is actually going to be detrimental to me in the long run. So for whatever reason, he refuses to follow through, which apparently was evil in the sight of Adonai also. And so he dies. So Judah is not liking what's happening here. 2 of his sons have now died. He might think that it has something to do with this particular woman. It's difficult to say what he exactly thinks about this, but it does seem that at this point, the youngest son is still a minor. Is not quite to marriageable age yet. And so he sends her away and says, go live in your father's house until he grows up, and then, we'll continue on and you'll get another chance with the 3rd son. So Judah's wife dies. The Canaanite woman dies. And he's going to go up to this festival, and at this part, Tamar is like, you are not keeping your end of the deal. So apparently some time has passed. The younger son is old enough to be married now, and Judah is kind of withholding that. And Tamar is aware of this. And so this is when she goes and she seduces Judah. And of course gets Judah to give her his ring and his staff, as this promise that he's going to eventually bring back this promised goat. But she does become pregnant with 2 sons, interestingly. So, which lines up with the 2 husbands that have died. Of course, as he's accusing her, she brings out these items of his that she has been given, and he realizes what's happened. And it even says in verse 26, then Judah recognized them and said, she is more righteous than I, since I didn't give her to my son Shelah. So this is really interesting. So we have some continued themes that we've seen. This comes about in this pattern of deception. Of course, because Judah did not know who she was. So we have a different kind of deception, but deception just the same with, as like we saw with Jacob and Esau. So this is continuing. But it's interesting. I just find it interesting that he says that she was more righteous than he was.
Where did that conclusion come from?
So, it's because he didn't do the right thing. He didn't give her his son, which was what he was supposed to do to be able to carry on the line of both his previous sons and his 3rd son. And now, the lines are going to be carried on. So the way that it was gone about, so basically she was making right what he had wronged her, and she had done something about it. And so he, in his understanding at this point of revelation that he's at, he considers that more righteous than himself.
Why do you suppose she felt like she had to deceive him to do it then?
That's a good question. I don't know. Again, there's not a lot of detail in the story, but I think some options are that she had gone to him and said, hey, your son's old enough, and he had kept putting her off and putting her off. There's, rumors going around, people are talking, maybe his son's going to get married to someone else, maybe there's some cultural thing that she just couldn't approach him. Maybe he had a reputation for doing this since his wife had died. Maybe, I don't know. We don't know for sure.
Well, it also says, she went down there, but he approached her. It wasn't vice versa. Like, she didn't go up and seduce him. He approached her.
Yeah. She was an opportunist. Similar to how we could say Jacob was an opportunist when Esau sold his birthright for that bowl of soup. So she was in the right place at the right time, but he did approach her, and she was wise in that moment then, I guess you could say, to ask for these particular items that then would prove, she knew that she had to be able to prove that the children she was carrying were his down the line, because she knew what fate she was going to meet. If, she was found out to be pregnant and they didn't know who the father was or it was someone else. So she's she kind of makes sure that she's there. And again, this could play into maybe this is in line with his reputation. Maybe he goes up to this festival and meets up with someone every year. We don't know. I don't know that that's true. I don't know that it's not. We don't have it in the text, and so we kind of just.
His wife did just die, right? Judah's wife in the beginning of the story.
Well, she had died. We don't know how much time passes between when she dies and when.
Right, I'm saying as far as the tradition, maybe
right.
He wasn't cheating on his wife when he went away, and it was
right,
just the fact that she had passed away.
Yeah, and that's one thing that many of the commentators point out. Like, the text is careful to say that his wife had died. So he's, yes, he's being promiscuous, but he's not cheating on his wife. So it's like, okay, great.
Right, goat should settle this.
I just find it's fascinating to me that it's like, you can see the Lord's hand in all of this, in the fact that, we've got the story of Joseph. That would seem to me like, because he was a prototype, this would be who the Savior would come through then. It would be one of Joseph's. It just seems like it should be like that. And of course, Judah's wife has died, but it's like the Lord has decided whose line that's going to come through. And it's all been orchestrated to make sure that Yeshua comes through the line.
Exactly.
But also to bring in all these incidents of messy family
Right.
of how it comes that way.
Right, right. And that's, this is just another story in the long line of, man, these people are really messed up. Like, there's just not a lot of these early stories that we look at and go, oh, that's just really lovely. They just loved each other, they were obedient. There's just not really many of those stories that we come through. And so that, like, it just points to this necessary wrestle that we have to have with the Lord, because I think we tend to, we want things to be black and white. We want to see that those who follow the Lord are blessed and those who don't are cursed, except there's always mixture. And so we have to wrestle with, so then how does the Lord judge that? How does the Lord still continue to let these people play the role in the story that they do, despite their very obvious and great shortcomings?
If nothing else, it's a whole lot more interesting than a Hallmark Christmas movie.
This is true. This is true. As it is Hallmark Christmas movie season. I mean, I like them too. Let's be real.
He's been teasing me.
Yeah, let's be real. Like, sometimes I will confess, I prefer a happy ending. I don't really care if it's unrealistic when I'm watching a movie. I would prefer to have a happy ending. Dystopian fiction became very popular for a while, and I got so upset that finally was like, I have to stop reading this. I have to stop watching these movies. Everything ends just as bad or worse than it started.
Yeah.
I can't do this. So anyway, it is more interesting, but it's also more real, because we all know those happy, they're unrealistic. This is real life. These are people, again, we've talked about, we're in this, the Torah is very much the story of progressive revelation. So, and in this story, we don't have God showing up and saying, it's not like this, angel of the Lord shows up to Judah and says, the Messiah is going to come through your line. We don't even know that they really have much of a concept of Messiah at this point. Maybe they do, maybe they don't. There's not blatant. I mean, they know the Genesis 3 story of, the seed of the woman will crush the head of the serpent. But who knows what they think that means at this point. And so, I mean, God obviously knows. But it's hard to say how much of that they know. And so it's not like God, they're just trying to live, really. And again, this woman is trying to make sure she's going to be taken care of. And she has been dealt with unjustly, and she's trying to right that. Do we agree with how she did it? Not necessarily. But desperate times call for the desperate measures. We don't know how righteous, this family really is. Judah's marrying a Canaanite woman. We have to believe that he knew that he wasn't supposed to do that. There's a lot of, we have to do a lot of guessing, because again, we don't have a lot of details. But I want to come back around to what you were saying, Lori, is that, what you're saying is exactly, the reason, because when we started out, I was saying that, this chapter about Judah and Tamar is kind of the one that we go, so we're talking about Joseph, and then there's this weird thing about Judah and Tamar, and then we go back to Joseph and we talk about Joseph. But it's interesting, but there is significance to this story here. And it does seem interesting, so I'm going to go back just a little bit and build a little bit more context, and then we're going to carry this forward. So in 37, so this is after, the brothers have devised this plan that they're going to throw Joseph down in the pit. In verse 26, it says, and Judah said to his brothers, what profit is there if we kill our brother and cover up his blood? Come on, let's sell him to the Ishmaelites. Let's not lay our hand on him, since he's our brother, our own flesh. And his brothers listened to him. And we're going to come back and we're going to talk about the rest of that little section in a little bit, because there's some interesting things in there. But the point is, Judah shows a little bit of ever so slight bit of integrity, that he's like, okay, we shouldn't actually kill him. Let's just sell him instead.
Let's make some money off of him.
Yeah, and so it's like, okay, but I mean, the part of the situation is at least he sees the value of life. We'll give him just a tiny little bit of credit. He's not like shining, brilliant shining armor at this point. He's not the savior of the story by any means. But so then we, after this has all happened and he's sold, that's when we have this story. So it's difficult to tell with the timing, because sometimes chronology is not the greatest priority in ancient narrative. So it's difficult to say, did Judah leave because his brothers mad at him for kind of messing up with his plan? Is this just kind of happening alongside? It's a little bit difficult to say. But we do have this situation, and kind of like like Lori was saying, because Joseph is this more righteous character, we would expect it to be his line that we would eventually follow on through, but it's not. It's Judah's. So Judah, and then remember later, this is probably I didn't look at the exact verse, it's probably next week's portion, maybe the one after, probably next week's, where, when the brothers kind of come down to Egypt because of the famine, that Judah kind of takes the place of Benjamin. He's trying to protect Benjamin. So Judah does seem to kind of get it together eventually. So maybe this is a turning point. Maybe this story is even partially to show us this turning point for Judah. He realizes he's wronged Tamar, and that he needs to live a more righteous life. Maybe that's part of it. But we also when we get to the very end of Genesis, in Genesis 49, this is when Jacob is speaking he's speaking over all of his sons, at the very least, at the very end of his life. When we get to verse 8, he speaks to Judah, and he says, Judah, so you are, your brothers will praise you, your hand will be on your enemy's neck, and your father's sons will bow down to you. A lion's cub is Judah, from the prey, my son, you've gone up. He crouches, lies down like a lion or like a lioness. Who would rouse him? The scepter will not pass from Judah, nor the ruler's staff from between his feet, until he to whom it belongs will come. To him will be the obedience of the peoples. So this is a text that is very often referenced as a messianic text. And I think rightfully so. For a couple, some of these reasons are obvious, but I'm just going to list them for you. So it says Judah will be superior, okay? And remember, think back to, Tom teaches this Judah first principle, because remember later on when we have the camp and the tabernacle set up, when the tabernacle moves, who moves first? Judah. Following, of course, the Levites and all the artifacts, but of the tribes, Judah goes first. So Judah's superior. Judah will be powerful like a lion. Of course, we have this Lion of Judah terminology later. Judah's scepter will not pass. The scepter is very much the sign of a king. And he has this, nor the ruler's staff, which is this role of a lawgiver or a legal authority. And then, so this, until he to whom it belongs will come, this sentence has a lot of debate about it. I'm not going to go into the details, but there's a lot of, but there's this word Shiloh that's used there, which is very interesting. So it's like, is this talking about a location? It doesn't actually make any sense to me, but okay. Some say it's the proper name of the Messiah, that it's just this ruler, or that it's pointing to this one figure that's to whom it belongs, which is how it's translated in the TLB, which is why they've put it this way, because this is what they've decided it means. I agree. I have a professor who went through this in great detail, and I can't give you the really detailed, wonderful explanation that he gave, but it makes sense if you look into Hebrew and how it kind of plays out. And also with just these, pairing it with the rest of this text that it's talking about, it does seem that it's talking about this one particular individual that's going to fulfill this very particular role somewhere down the line. And so this is very much seen as looking toward the Messiah. So the reason that this is significant in light of this story with Judah and Tamar is what kind of Lori was bringing up earlier, is that the story of Judah and Tamar shows that the line of Judah continues. Because it seems that Judah did not have any intention of giving his youngest son to Tamar, and so then his line ends. That's a problem. If the line of Judah ends, the entire rest of the story is different. Not that God wouldn't still bring a Messiah, that something wouldn't happen, but we would have a very, very different story. Because this is, for whatever reason, the particular line that God has chosen to bring the Messiah through. And again, this points to, and so it's this, so this story kind of dropped into, and we can talk about this a little bit when we kind of start talking about Joseph a little bit, but we can even see this contrast between Joseph and Judah, which is also significant, but both mightily used by God. And, you know, like we said, it's interesting that Judah was the one who this line came through, but that's how God has set it up. And he, you know, as he's being blessed by Jacob, when Jacob's about to die, and on these very specific things that point to this very unique individual, because we've talked about before, you know, the Messiah holds these roles of prophet, priest, and king. And there are others who are talked about with some of those terms. There are some scholars who like to stretch some of the meanings to put all of those terms on some other people as foreshadows of the Messiah. But really, in the truest sense of the words, and the truest sense of what those roles are, no one fulfills them until Yeshua. But this line of Judah is still very important. Even connecting, you know, one more jump to Matthew's genealogy. You know, Matthew 1, the book of the genealogy of Yeshua, from Mashiach ben David ben Abraham fathered Isaac, Isaac fathered Jacob, Jacob fathered Judah and his brothers. Judah fathered Perez and Zerah by Tamar. Perez fathered Hezron, Hezron fathered Ram, Ram fathered Aminadab, Aminadab fathered Nahshon, Nahshon fathered Salmon, Salmon fathered Boaz by Rahab, Boaz fathered Obed by Ruth, Obed fathered Jesse, and Jesse fathered David the king. And of course then we go on from David up to Yeshua. So, as difficult as this Judah and Tamar situation is, it apparently is very important. Because Tamar is mentioned, even to the point that Tamar is mentioned in the genealogy, along with Rahab and Ruth. So apparently, you know, God is not so concerned with this really complicated genealogy. Because we have Moabite women, we have Canaanites, we have lots of different ethnicities represented within this genealogy, including Tamar, and it seems that God is okay with that.
So the Lord used the result of this. This is not a great way to say this, but the Judah being promiscuous.
Mm-hmm.
He actually used that.
Mm-hmm.
Pretty good.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Judah thought he was being promiscuous, meanwhile he was fulfilling his obligation, right?
Sure.
He was deceived in his own mind, but he really didn't do anything wrong, right? In his mind he thought he was he was going to, right, be with this woman, but he was actually fulfilling messianic prophecy.
Right,
Mind,
which
right?
then even plays back to how he says that Tamar is more righteous.
Yeah.
Well, and I kind of, when I was reading through this and kind of processing this, it's like, in my mind, maybe like, the Lord wanted that generation to come through Tamar.
Mm-hmm.
The Lord is the one that killed Judah's first two sons.
Mm-hmm.
And it kind of seems like, you know, since Judah sent her away, Judah was blaming her.
Mm-hmm.
He wasn't looking, it was like, she's the reason my kids are dying. Not because the Lord's displeased with my sons, let's blame this woman for it. In which, obviously, he had no intention. He says, I'll give you my youngest son, but he's like,
Right.
this is gonna happen. And the Lord's gonna still make sure that this line comes through this woman who's being slighted here.
Mm-hmm.
You know, and I think that, to me, that's kind of like beautiful in a sense that maybe that youngest son, that's who the line was supposed to come through, but Judah didn't give it to him. That
Mhm.
still would have been a descendant of
Right.
Judah,
Mm-hmm.
but Judah wouldn't give her
Right.
his youngest son,
Right.
but the Lord was still gonna bring
Mm-hmm.
that line through that woman.
Mm-hmm.
He may not be flexible, but he's certainly creative.
Yes.
Very true. Yeah, and it's like, I mean, I get, and this is this is another thing, because people like to point back to some of these stories in the Torah and say, women are treated so terribly. But really, sorry, I have like a crack. But really, again, this is why it's important to have just the tiniest thought and understanding of some of the ancient context is that he's really caring for them. I mean, you think of this genealogy that we just read, Tamar, Rahab, and Ruth. All women in really difficult situations, all of whom become part of the lineage of Yeshua, all of whom are mentioned in the genealogy, when it's very uncommon to mention women in genealogies. Unless there's like multiple wives and you're designating whose son was whose or something. But we don't have that designation with Jacob and his wives in this genealogy, in Matthew's genealogy. And so, but all these women, like I said, like they're all women in very difficult situations, all of whom really, how they wind up in the lineage of Yeshua is because of the Lord, of the hand of the Lord, putting them in the right place at the right time. Again, there are difficult aspects to this Judah and Tamar story. I'm not suggesting that God is happy with deception and prostitution and promiscuity and all those things. I'm not saying that. I don't think you think I'm saying that. But the point is that this was justice for Tamar. And I think that she was probably well taken care of the rest of her life. Not only because I think Judah probably took care of her. I think Judah probably, it says that he was not intimate with her again, but I think he probably took care of her. She probably lived with his family, and then raised her sons and was taken care of by them. And so this is justice for her. Yeah. And the same with Rahab and Ruth. How they, how their stories work out is justice for them. So I just like to point that out because we like to, and even, we can talk about I guess we could talk about a little bit about this later, but it's like, polygamy and slavery and these kinds of things. I'm not saying that these are things that God is happy about, but he does use them, and in some ways, and in a lot of cases, they're different in ancient culture than how our modern minds think of them. And it is important, even if we don't understand everything about ancient culture, it is important to at least acknowledge that there's something that we don't understand. And so, that was different then. Okay, so yes.
It seems like Judah is a little closed off in the sense that he doesn't, from what Laura said, he doesn't realize that it's him, and it seems like he's carried this burden of his brother away from his family and into this new setting where he's living, and he's not addressing his own, things that are going on, and it's gotta be Tamar's fault, it couldn't possibly be mine. So that's why I say I think he was kind of closed off to the reality of the guilt that he was carrying from Joseph.
Which is interesting because we think back to what we talked about with Isaac. Isaac seemed very separated and closed off. And it seems like those situations when someone is more isolated and goes off and is potentially carrying guilt of some kind. I don't know that guilt was so much Isaac's story. He was trying to be protected from Ishmael, but
Definitely Jacob.
But and Jacob being close. And so it seems that further complicates the story. So something about that guilt, that separation, that this not being in right relationship with the rest of the family seems to have consequences. Because they're really trying to then make it on their own. They're trying to create their own life, their own, bring redemption as much as they can sometimes, but they're just in these difficult situations that they're not really with the rest of the family in the relationship that they were supposed to have. They're kind of having to make their own way, and when people have to make their own way, you make some decisions that maybe are not the best. Or it just is hard and it's complicated and you do the best you can with what you have. So I think that that's a pattern, I think that's a pattern that we see, is this kind of isolation and what happens within that through the generations. Okay. So now we can kind of go back and we can start we can look at the Joseph part of this portion a little bit. So Joseph, so in this portion it focuses a lot on both before he's sold into slavery and once he is kind of in prison in Egypt. Kind of one of the main things about this portion are the dreams. And they seem to come in pairs. Dreams were important. People paid attention to their dreams in ancient culture. It's interesting. It's always interesting to me when I come across some of these dreams in scripture to think about, because there are many testimonies. If you ever listen to testimonies of Jewish people, or very often, Muslim, Arab people who come to know the Lord, it's through a dream or a vision. There's a lot of weight in Islam on dreams. And so but it happens a lot with Jewish people as well. Yeshua reveals himself in a dream. So it's interesting that, so I kind of always think about that, like this is still a way that the Lord works, is through dreams and visions. So Joseph has both a reputation of dreaming dreams and interpreting dreams. So of course, in 37, the dreams that he has, this first dream that he has is verse 6 and 7. So please listen to this dream I dreamed. There we were binding sheaves in the middle of the field. All of a sudden my sheaf arose and stood upright, and behold, your sheaves gathered around and bowed down to my sheaf. Will you truly be a king over us? His brothers said to him, will you really rule over us? So they hated him even more because of these dreams and because of these words. So then he dreams another dream. It says, I've just dreamed another dream. Suddenly there was the sun and the moon and the 11 stars bowing down to me. And then his father, even though he's the favored son of his father, this is interesting, that his father rebukes him and says, what's this dream you dreamed? Will we really come, your mother and I, with your brothers, to bow down to the ground to you? So the brothers were jealous of him, but his father kept this speech in mind. So his father is rebuking him, but his father is also, he's remembering this. He knows enough, he at least is wise enough to say, this is something to pay attention to.
In the commentaries that you've read, I mean, do they believe that this was maybe out of sync with timing, because it mentions his mother bowing down, but he already have his mother dead at this point? What have you read on that?
I've read multiple ideas. I don't think some say that yes, it's kind of out of order, and some say that Jacob is making a point, that kind of pointing to how crazy this dream is, that even your mother, even though she's already gone, would bow down. Some say it could be referencing, I'm just going to try to see where, if it's said in this one, I can't remember. Oh yeah, because previously in verse 2, it mentions his father's wives, Bilhah and Zilpah, which are the servants, but since both Leah and Rachel have died at this point, now it seems like they're being called wives. Because this is very unusual. This whole thing about their status as wives is very unusual. Usually the servants are not counted as wives. Yeah. Like Hagar is not counted as a wife of Isaac, Abraham. Mixing my generations here. Sorry, you know what I mean.
Or is it just an assumption that Jacob made right off the bat that the moon would mean his mom?
Possibly. I haven't read that one, but I've basically read, the main ideas that I've read are that it's out of order. So this dream happened before his mother died. I don't know, that Jacob is being, trying to make a point and saying, this is kind of absurd that you're saying that we're all going to bow down to you. Because Joseph doesn't say when he's telling about the dream exactly what these represent. They're inferring this on their own as they're responding.
There's no point that imply that anybody, including Joseph, believes this is of God.
True. Yeah, I mean, it doesn't say that. Based on how, so later when he's in Egypt, he always is referencing back to God, and that God is the one who gives dream, God is the one who gives interpretation, but you're right, he doesn't say that here.
Which is why it's important that he doesn't do that here.
Yeah, so it's possible that he gets this revelation later, but with dreams, the common understanding was that they were from someone. So if they're allegiant to God, to Adonai, they probably would have had some thought, but you're right, it doesn't say it. So we don't know exactly what they thought of
And
this.
if Jacob thought it was from God, he wouldn't have rebuked Joseph for having the dream.
Probably not.
Or unless the rebuke is just basically, you shouldn't be saying this to people. Because it does say he kept it.
Yeah, he does keep it to pay attention to, which makes me think that Jacob thinks it's possible that it's from God.
Mm-hmm.
He maybe thinks, it does seem that Joseph is a bit, his brothers hate him because he's the favored one of their father, but it doesn't seem like Joseph does a great job of being humble either.
It was a tattletale too.
So it's not, Joseph isn't helping himself out a whole lot, so, kind of spreading this idea of, hey, you guys are all going to serve me is probably not his best idea. In this situation, that probably the way that he's sharing this is probably really not helping him out, because it even says the responses that they hated him even more. He's already singled out as the favored one, and now he's saying that they're all going to worship, bow down to him, and they're not pleased. So
well, he's not just the favored one, on top of the fact that he also reports back to his dad on his brothers.
Right.
So he's a giant tattletale, so who wants the little brother that's going to go tell on you?
Right, which is interesting with Jacob too, because Jacob's the one who sends him to go check up on the brothers.
Yeah.
It's Jacob is not helping
Yeah.
the sibling rivalry here. Yeah.
Which is what I was going to say, is that Jacob is adding to this, and I think it first starts with him separating the wives and the kids and putting all of them first. If we should die, let them die first, right? So I think that's just the first of his long list of parenting mistakes that he's making so far.
And repeating the mistakes of his father.
Yes.
Right? Because his father favored Esau.
Yes.
And so you think, Dennis Prager brings up, he's you would think that he would have learned that having a favorite child doesn't go well. But apparently not. And Dennis Prager makes a comment too. He's really, the Torah, he says he makes the point that if the Torah had another, or Genesis had a name other than Genesis, it would be deception. And he has a list of 10, these 10 different, from Abraham, all these different things, including Judah and Tamar and Isaac and, Jacob and Esau and, all these different things, even down to this. And it's so Prager's one of the main things that we learn from Genesis is that people don't learn from other people's mistakes. People seem to have to learn from their own. Which of course is not always true. We hope that we can have moments where we can learn from someone else and not make the same mistake. But generally we learn the biggest lessons by making our own mistakes. And so humans are human.
And it's comforting to know that they were that messed up.
Right.
Because it means that, okay, there is hope.
Yeah.
Yeah, well, because I think it comes back to, I always think of, as I, go through the Torah year after year and, look more and more into the details, it's it just reinforces the very simple point that they're human. Mm-hmm. And it makes me think of, because I think, I think back to Sunday school stories, and even Noah was the biggest one that got me. I'm as I grew up and read it, I'm why is this a Sunday school story? This is not a children's story. This is horrific.
Happy end.
Happy ending, yes. But it's this is real. This is, and so I think we almost like glorify some of these characters. We turn them into characters in the Bible, which is more unrealistic, playing into our Hallmark movie example of like, yeah, like with Noah, it's like, yeah, Noah was the righteous one, he saved all the animals, and then there's this rainbow. Oh, that's nice. Except everyone else died and was evil. And Noah saw all of that. And then he gets, off the boat, and the first thing he does is get drunk, and, I'm like, it's like, this is not all sunshine and roses here. My point is, it makes me even think back to Rich's message a couple of weeks ago, talking about, the spirit and the physical, because I think our tendency is to look back at some of these stories and think of them as characters, and we think of all the great things we did, which we should. I mean, God himself is honoring their righteousness and, the things that they did right. But in the midst of all of that, they were human. They were living in a physical world. They were dealing with, culture. They were dealing with physical realities of famine and, having to work the ground and sickness and all these things that you have to deal with in the physical. So it is very much the spirit and physical together. And so I think it is helpful to look back and say, oh, these are humans. And in that sense, be able to relate to them. It's like, oh man, they messed up, for sure. And God doesn't excuse them for, their shortcomings, but he is the faithful one. And so he continues the story, and he continues, we're in Genesis, 37 through 40, and think back to, Genesis 3, how far we've come. Think back to Noah versus now. Like, think of how far we've come of Revelation. God seems, and it's also this reinforcement of this idea that God does not seem concerned with the time it takes to bring the story to its fullness. Because already we're, I don't know how many generations into the story, and we're kind of like barely seeing that they are able to walk with God, and so, and of course we don't, until Yeshua, we don't see, but also that's like the gift of Yeshua, is that he came as a man, he came as a human. Yes, he was also fully God, but he lived a human life, so he felt pain, he felt joy, he felt all the full range of human emotion. He just, because he's also fully God, is able to do it without sin. He was able to do it without falling into deception, without falling into all of these other things. But he was still very human. He needed relationships. He needed other people. He did not isolate himself. Anytime he goes out, other than when he's tempted in the wilderness, he's by himself then, but that's a very unique, specific experience to him.
It's a one-on-one standoff.
Yeah, and he's able to do that because he's God. But other than that, like, even he goes off to pray. He takes his closest friends with him. He doesn't end up in this isolated situation. He is always surrounded by community and people and relationship. So all that to say, I think we have swung, in our theology to the very spiritual side of things, that I think to swing back to the humanity a little bit, while still keeping the spiritual side is very important, but to swing back to the humanity and read these stories and be hit with the humanity of the people that we're reading about, and realize that they were actually people. They're not just, characters on the felt storyboard in Sunday school, or in the Hallmark movie, with the perfect happy ending that everything gets tied up in a nice little bow. It's like, no, they're real people, which means they do stupid things. So, anyway, there's my soapbox about Bible stories and humanity.
Well, I find it actually comforting when you read this to know that even my character flaws and my mess ups throughout my life is not going to derail God's plans and purposes for my kids and for my grandkids. That's kind of comforting, because you could go, well, I did this when my kids were 3 years old, and therefore, you know, don't they messed up for life or whatever, you know, and you look at the kind of stuff that these people did, yet the story goes on, and the Lord is still working. His plans and purposes are so much bigger than their character flaws and their mess ups. And I think we can see that today too.
Yeah, and I think we even see over the course of time, over the course of time, we see the concept of teshuvah, of repentance. Even though they're not saying, and I, went before the Lord and repented. Like, even, with Judah, it's like, he was part of the plan to kill and then sell Joseph. He was part of this Tamar thing, but then he's the one pleading for Benjamin's life, so there is, did he become perfect? No, but it seems that the trajectory of his life is in a positive direction.
He's trending.
And I think we see that with Jacob too. Yes, Jacob, was involved in all this deception, but I think the trajectory of his life is in a positive direction. I think that we see that, and so I think that's, I think we can, it's kind of putting together the micro and the macro, right? It's like looking at, this person was in a situation where they were, Joseph was really stupid to be bragging about these dreams in front of his brothers. And yet, he weeps with joy over seeing his brothers when they come to Egypt for help and they don't recognize him, and that relationship is restored. And he gives credit to God for everything that happens when he's in Pharaoh's house and in prison and interpreting dreams. He's saying, it's God who does this. It's God. And so, again, positive trajectory of life. And so, we learn from looking at these specific instances, but I think it's also important to keep in mind the overall trajectory of life. And I think it helps us a lot if we think about that in people, in just people that we know, I guess.
I'm jumping ahead a little bit, but when I heard you mention Jacob, it was amazing to me all those years that Jacob believed a lie. From the time his sons brought the tunic to him with the blood on it, he grabbed hold of that lie. And all of those years, he believed that Joseph was dead.
Yeah. Which then, think about when he found out that he wasn't. Think about him finding out that Joseph is alive. It's like resurrection, right? Yeah.
Doesn't Jacob refuse to mourn with his children at some point when he finds out? Because I think that refusing to mourn was his hope. Because I think the mourning, Joseph, I know he was sackcloth and ashing and everything, but I think he refuses to mourn. I read that in a commentary by Sachs, Jonathan Sachs. And he said that Joseph doesn't necessarily, he refuses to mourn to some degree, and that was his hope, that Joseph was around or alive to the point he wouldn't give in to that completely.
Well, I'd have to read further on, because in this part of the narrative it specifically says that he mourned.
Where are we at?
In 37, 33.
Oh, to be comforted. He refused to be comforted.
In 34, he tore his clothes and put on sackcloth and mourned his son many days.
He was saying comforted. I used the wrong word.
Oh, okay.
Mourn. He said comforted. He refused to be comforted.
Oh, okay. Okay. Yeah, that makes more sense. Oh, yes. He refused to be comforted. Yes. Yes, that makes more sense, because I was like, it does say he mourned, but that's good. So Joseph, I'm doing a lot of talking today, sorry, but some of this narrative intersects with so many other pieces of the story that I think is cool. So the other thing I like to point out with Joseph is, because like I said at the very beginning, this Joseph narrative is the longest narrative about a particular person that we have in the Torah other than Moses. Moses obviously takes up most of the Torah. And so his life is pretty significant. And let's see. No, I'm not going to be able to find exactly what I want. Because Joseph is referenced a few times, but he's not one of the patriarchs. He's not who's really talked about, but he is the one who saves the Jewish people in some sense. And so Joseph's story, and we have a couple more weeks with Joseph in the portion, so we'll continue to see this, but I want to point out as something to read even as we keep in mind as you're going through the Torah is that Joseph is included where most people would include Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, and then very often skip to David, and then and so on. When talking about the histories and the legacy or the background behind talking about messianic prophecy and all these different things, Joseph is mentioned in Stephen's speech in Acts, end of Acts 6 through 7, when Stephen is about to become the first martyr. He is before the Cohen and the high priest, and he gives this basically summary of the Torah, and it's pretty amazing. I love this section of this speech. So really, in chapter 7, and most of chapter 7 is his actual speech. But he talks about Abraham, and he talks about that covenant, excessively. But then he talks about Joseph, and the patriarchs are jealous of him, and he's sold into Egypt, but God is with him, and he rescues them. And so there's actually a significant little section within, in the grand scheme of this speech that he gives, Joseph actually gets a lot more space than most other people would give him. And I think that's really significant because I kind of sometimes refer to Stephen's speech as like, this is, this summary of Torah. Because what he pulls out there, what he's speaking to the high priest, and this argument that he's making for Yeshua being the Messiah is all based in Torah and all based in how Torah points to the Messiah. So if you haven't read it for a while, I would recommend going back and reading Stephen's speech in Acts 7. And of course, the end of that when he sees his Messiah highly exalted as he's dying, and then we meet Saul. That's our introduction to Saul, which is interesting. So all that to say that Joseph, there are lots of ways, and so since we're kind of at the beginning of this Joseph story right now, I would suggest to you also to be looking for ways that Joseph is a really good example of one of these pre-messianic figures. There are a lot of things about Joseph that point to the Messiah and that mirror Yeshua's life. So I would encourage you to look for some of those principles going through. So that being said, we have just a few minutes left. I've gone a lot of different directions today, but we can pull out anything that anybody else wants to talk about from the portion. Yes?
Do you think, and this is a question I don't know the answer to, do you think that Joseph, there was a chance he might have been aware of what Adonai told Abram with regard to your people will be enslaved for 400 years? Do you think he might have started putting things together after a while with what was going on?
Yeah, I think it's possible. I think it's fairly safe to assume that these stories were passed down. It was a very oral culture. So I think it's fairly safe to assume that the stories had been passed down to some extent. So yeah, we don't know how much detail he had and what, and we don't know what he thought of his own role in it. Because, we're kind of to the point now where, God himself in the form of this angel of the Lord has appeared to Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob And he doesn't really do that. He doesn't appear in that way to any of the 12 sons. Obviously God is working. Many of the commentaries even see the hand of God in him being sold and how he was sold into slavery and lots of other things throughout the story. And of course he does give credit to God, so he has some familiarity with God in some form, but God is not appearing to Joseph. So it's hard to say to what extent that he thought he was playing a role in that covenantal prophecy and promise that was given to Abraham, because it's possible that he expected God to appear to in the midst of that, but it's possible that he totally made that connection. It's hard to say, but I don't think it's unreasonable to assume that he had some level of awareness of that prophecy. I do want to point out one other thing I forgot. I was going to come back to this one section. So going back to chapter 37, verse 26, which we read the first couple verses of this little section earlier when we were talking about Judah. But I don't think I had noticed this before until I read it this year. It's funny how things that you read every year you don't really notice until all of a sudden sometime you do. So Judah said to his brothers, "What profit is there if we kill our brother and cover up his blood? Come on, let's sell him to the Ishmaelites. Let's not lay our hand on him, since he's our brother, our own flesh." His brothers listened to him. Okay. So when some men, the Midianite merchants, passed by, they dragged Joseph up out of the pit, and they sold Joseph to the Ishmaelites for 20 pieces of silver, and they brought Joseph to Egypt. And when Reuben returned to the pit and saw that Joseph was not in the pit, he tore his clothes. And then he returned to his brothers and said, "The boy is gone, and where should I go?" Who sold Joseph?
His brothers.
Is that what it says?
The Midianites.
The Midianites. It says the Midianites pulled him up out of the pit and sold him to the Ishmaelites.
Read it again.
So Judah says, "Let's sell him to the Ishmaelites. Let's not lay our hands on him, since he's our own brother." And his brothers listened to him. When some men, Midianite merchants, passed by, they dragged Joseph up and out of the pit, and they sold Joseph to the Ishmaelites for 20 pieces of silver, and they brought Joseph to Egypt.
So does that say the brothers weren't even there at the time?
It sounds that way. Now, there's a couple different ways you could read this. So I would say you could read this as the they that pulled him out of the pit was the brothers. But then why is Reuben so alarmed to find him not there, and then returning to his brothers and saying he's not there, if he was part of that plan? So you can read it either way. Really, it lends itself either way. But several of the commentaries I read do actually suggest that it wasn't Joseph's brothers who sold him, that it was the Midianites who came and pulled him up and sold him to the Ishmaelites in the first place. Which means his brothers very well. So then his brothers carried on with this plan to soak the tunic in blood and take it to his father, who then assumes that he's been killed. So again, possibilities here. We don't know. We don't have the details, but possibilities here that that his brothers think that he's been killed, even though they don't have a body, think that he's been killed or kidnapped or something, that they don't know where he is, that they think that he's died as well. And even if he's been kidnapped, if they don't know where he is, in their minds he would have been kind of as good as dead. And so, but I thought that was really interesting. So again, it is possible that the they that pulled him up is the brothers. But seems a bit contrary to the brothers' confusion and that he's gone. So, I don't know. I just think that's kind of interesting, that maybe the brothers weren't as guilty as we think they were. They were still guilty. They still left him for dead.
Somebody beat him to it.
Yeah. So, they're not free of blame, but because they left him for dead, they put him in a well that had no water. And so they left him with no food or water, and they went and had a meal. So they played a role for sure, but it's just interesting to think, what does that mean? Does that mean that they sold him or that they didn't? Yes.
But if you go to 45 and you reveals himself to his brothers. He says, you sold me in Egypt.
Uh-huh. So, again, does that mean that they, I mean, and it's possible that they did. Or is it that they as good as sold him? Maybe they came along the Midianites along the way and said, hey, he's down in that pit. You want to pull him up, you can have him. I don't know. I think there's still some flexibility there. I mean, they definitely played a part in what happened to him. So I think that it's interesting that maybe that this went, because Reuben, of course, was going to go and rescue him. Reuben was feeling bad about this. Wasn't feeling so great about this decision to kill and sell their brother. But at the same time, so either Reuben wasn't part of the plan to sell him, or things didn't go quite as they planned, or that they really did sell him. It's just one of those, I don't know, it's just one of those interesting things that it might not have been, it's not quite as straightforward as maybe we thought it was. Anyway, so that's kind of a strange place to end with this. We don't know what happened really with Joseph, the section, but but the point is that it does seem that it was that Joseph is the one who is supposed to go to Egypt and create a way for the ultimate salvation and rescuing of his brothers in this famine. Which is interesting too. I mean, because he's in Egypt for quite a long time before the whole thing happens with his brothers. And so it takes a while for him to set up this situation, even though he finds favor. And this is another, we can end on this too. So even though we don't have God directly appearing in the form of the man, in the form of the angel of the Lord to Joseph, he does seem to carry the favor of the Lord. Because very similar to when Jacob was with Laban, and Laban's household is blessed and becomes very, flocks are multiplying and, all this wealth and all these flocks and all of these things, while Jacob is with them. In a very similar way, when Joseph is in Pharaoh's house, there seems to be lots of multiplication. And we don't have time to get into it because we need to go, but even in this situation with, and this is a bit of you can kind of juxtapose Joseph and Judah as well, when Potiphar's wife is trying to seduce Joseph and he's like, no, we have this very different situation where Judah was willing to go with Tamar, Joseph is unwilling to go with Potiphar's wife. But even when she's accusing Joseph to her husband, in that situation, I mean, at this time, the consequence for that is usually being put to death. And Potiphar just puts him in prison, where he's treated very well. I mean, yes, he's still a prisoner, but he's still treated well. And again, he gains favor there. And so it's this interesting, like, the hand of the Lord is there, and it's like, so then you can ask the question about Potiphar of, did he believe his wife?
Yeah.
Maybe he had some doubt about her.
He had to do something, but.
Yeah,
still.
He couldn't just let Joseph go scot-free, but it doesn't seem like the punishment matches what we have. And so we see this favor on Joseph, this hand of the Lord, even in the midst of, this difficult situation, that the Lord is setting him up to be able to save his family, and bring blessing. Because, even though, again, comparing back to Jacob with, he's working for Laban, and Laban is kind of keeping him, far beyond what was originally agreed to. There's a lot of blessing that comes with that, and, God even gives Jacob the method of getting to take the flocks with him, and then you have Joseph, who is being accused of this high crime with Potiphar's wife, and yet he's okay, and he's in this really good position to gain favor, even with, even amongst the cupbearer and the baker and the head of the prison, whatever his name is. Like, there's this favor that comes, like, that God is clearly, even though it doesn't make sense to us, and it's like, man, this is a really difficult situation, and this is less than ideal for someone who is, you know, this righteous man, but God is still there, God is still with him, and I think it, you know, even Joseph sowing these seeds of referring to God and everything that happens with the dreams and with, you know, and all these things that are happening while he's in Egypt is also really significant and plays into, you know, this favor that's coming on him is truly from the Lord. So we will end there. Again, we have a couple more weeks of this Joseph narrative, which is very interesting. I always really enjoy the Joseph aspect. So I will pray to close us, and we will go to service. So Lord, we just thank you again for Shabbat and for studying your word and for your Torah and for the fact that you used real people to accomplish your plans, Lord, that you want relationship with humans so much that you're willing to guide and work through really difficult situations. Lord, I just ask that you would continue to refine us and lead us to righteousness and lead us to holiness, Lord, so that we can have even greater relationship with you. Thank you for your Holy Spirit that dwells within us, that helps us on that path. And Lord, I just ask that your presence would continue to be with us through the rest of Shabbat and this week, and as we enter into Hanukkah and celebrating the miracles that you did through that story, and as we remember, and I ask that you just build hope and expectation in us that you are going to continue to work in the way that you always have, Lord. That you're always present with us, that you're always working, that you're always are creating a way when we don't think there is a way. So Lord, we just thank you and we love you. B'Shem Yeshua.
Yeah, that Ishmaelite Midianite